This is William Blake's poem London, and what I'm going to do in the three parts for this particular video is to split it by its four stanzas. So we're going to start with a little bit of context, a little bit of background and the first stanza. Then we'll look at the middle two stanzas, and then in the third part we'll look at stanza 4 and some of the poems that it links to. I think it's a very straightforward poem. There's loads of those great quotes where you can take a little bit and squeeze an enormous amount out of them. It's an easily memorable poem because firstly it's quite short, so it's very manageable, but it's also lots of repetition and rhythm. So actually it'll be one of the few poems where you can really try and actually memorize the full poem. And the rhythm is there because we've got Blake, the poet William Blake, walking around the streets of London. And so the rhythm is reflective of the pace of his walk around the streets. 1 foot, then another foot, 1 foot, then another foot. And this stressed and unstressed syllable pattern goes all the way through the poem. But also that rhythm reflects the rhythm of life. It's ordered, it's controlled. And the whole poem is about how those in power, those in the government, in the church, in the royal family, keep the poor in their place. And the rhythm kind of reflects that relentless control, that hopelessness, that inescapable feeling of being controlled, of being secure in one particular place with a lack of escape. We've also got an enormous amount of repetition in the poem. So one of our key quotes today, marks of weakness, marks of woe. The other one I've got on the board charted is repeated in there as well. And the reason for so much repetition is that William Blake is trying to emphasize certain points. So he mentions the same words again and again and again in order to hammer home his message of the control and the poverty and the hopelessness in the slums of London. Now, London was a time of great polarity in 1793 when Blake wrote the poem. Now, for those of you who've done A Christmas Carol, for instance, you're 50 years prior to Dickens at this point, so it's pre-Victorian. But all of that poverty that you'll have looked at if you'll have looked at Dickens, that huge difference between the rich and the poor in Victorian London is emphasised only more a little bit earlier. In actual fact, in Victorian times, it had started to get a little bit better. So we're talking very much about that sort of historical time, a time where the rich, and we're talking here about the government, we're talking about the monarchy, we're talking about the state. The church was very, very important and kept people in their place by telling them that they had to go to church on a Sunday, that they would go to hell if they sinned and so forth. So the church was a method of control as well. And you've also got the real poor. And in the slums of London, which is what Blake is writing about here, in the slums of London you've got high mortality rates. People dying because of the diseases in the water, the overcrowding in the slums, which meant that diseases like cholera, diphtheria, typhoid would pass very quickly from one person to another. Lack of decent medical care, so the mortality rate was high. You had high infant mortality, childbirth death was very common, as was death for the mothers in childbirth, and that cycle of poverty just continued. You had a great amount of lawlessness because the only way to survive was to try and steal food for your family, for instance. You had prostitution, incredibly poor housing conditions, a really, really grim place to live. And Blake looks at this and wonders why this happens. And his conclusion is that the poor are kept there by the rich, and it actually serves the rich to have the poor who work for them in the factories, who risk their lives, for instance, going up chimneys in order to clean for the rich. So the rich are actually served by keeping the poor in their place. And Blake was horrified by this and felt that each person needed some sort of hope, some sort of escape from that. And the inspiration for Blake came across the channel with the French Revolution, which was, again, something that really closely influenced Blake in his work. And he looked across at how the poor in France rose up, overthrew the monarchy, and the very beginnings of democracy had just begun to start. It went wrong for France when Napoleon came back in power, amongst other things. But Blake was inspired by that sense of revolution, the sense that things can change. And he felt that something was needed like this in Britain, that we needed to revolt against power, claim some sort of say in society for the poor in order to try and change their condition. But what horrified Blake so much was that fight just wasn't there, because they were so downtrodden, because they were so kept in their place. Blake notices that sense of hopelessness. He notices that there's no fight in the poor anymore. It was easier to drink gin than to drink the water because it numbed the pain, and it was also probably cleaner than the water. So the whole cycle of poverty, of lawlessness, of difficulty was so entrenched. They were so used to it that they couldn't escape it. And Blake saw that the fight just wasn't there for the poor. So he wrote this poem as a protest at how the poor were being kept in their position, and it was meant to be rousing, it was meant to be shocking, it was meant to try and inspire more of the rich to do something about this and to try and make society a little bit more equal. So let's read through the whole poem and then we'll focus on the first stanza. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. A mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blights the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Lots and lots going on there. You'll have noticed the repetition, chartered, marks, every. And it's emphasising the scale of this poverty, the scale of this problem, the scale of the polarity between the rich and the poor. So let's start. I wander through each chartered street. Notice it's in the present tense. This is something that is happening now, and that is what is at the heart of the poem. This is what Blake is seeing with his own eyes. He's witnessed it himself. I wander. And it's almost continuous, isn't it? The idea that if he went round the streets all of the time, he would see this. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. Now let's have a look at chartered straight away. Chartered means controlled, regulated. It comes from the same root as the word chart, you know, a table. So it's kept in control. Now the streets, we might think about how they are chartered. And it's all about how the slums were thrown together, family on top of family, and tiny rules, regulated, kept in their place, unable to get past their streets in order to break through to the richer parts of society, so they're controlled. And of course the streets were designed in order to provide wider space for the rich and narrower poor space for those in the slums, those in poverty. And Blake is using that repetition of charter to show how the whole of life is controlled in that way. The rich and the poor are deliberately kept apart. What's more interesting, perhaps, is near where the chartered Thames does flow. The Thames, of course, the river that runs through London. And we might think about, how is the river controlled? Well, at this point, 1793, we're right in the swing of the Industrial Revolution. London was probably the busiest city in the world, the centre of world trade. Ships were heading out all over the world with the produce, the materials from London, and plenty more was coming into London as well. It was almost the centre of the universe. The British Empire was beginning at that point as well, and we'll come on to that in the second part. So a hugely busy city. Now, with the Industrial Revolution, that is often built on water. The water powers the mill and so forth, but also the produce, the materials, the things bought and sold were transported by ship. So it's man controlling nature. It's using that natural resource of the water, of the River Thames, for man's purposes, to make money, to make the rich richer effectively. But it's the river that is the centre of all of that world trade, and it's controlled which ships come in, which ships go out. So it's man controlling nature. And also notice the fact that chartered is repeated. It's emphasising the control. And remember, keep going back, it's the state who is controlling, the government, the church, the monarchy. And that is the group of people who are controlling everything. And at this point, with the chartered Thames, probably controlling the whole worldwide economy out of the huge city of London. Okay, so there's lots going on there. And mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. Now, he's wandering through the poor parts at this point, and he's marked in every single face he meets. So what he's talking about here is the facial expression of those, and the faces tell a story of being downtrodden, of being hopeless, of not being able to escape, the marks of poverty. So when he marks in every face he meets, that's him seeing it. He marks it, and it's imprinted on his mind, because a mark is something that is branded, isn't it? It's tattooed almost onto your skin. It's permanent. And so first of all, a mark in every face I meet, it's permanently in William Blake's head. He has seen this for his own eyes, and he's always keeping that vision of what he's seen. He can't escape the poverty that he's witnessed. But also he's talking about the marks of weakness, marks of woe of those that he has seen. Now, weakness, that lack of power, their place in society, they've got no hope. They've got no say. They've got no escape. And the marks of woe, woe is misery. So he's seeing, almost branded permanently on these people's faces, the misery and the lack of power and the hopelessness. These are people who have given up. They've not got the fight perhaps like they had in France with the French Revolution. So he's calling them to arms. He's trying to suggest, look, we've got to do something about this. We've got to change this. But it's so imprinted, it's so permanent, the poor are kept in their place. There's no escape for them. And that repetition emphasises that hopelessness. So it's a really easy first verse to remember, because of that rhythm, because of that pace, because of that repetition. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. You've got the first two lines straight away, the repetition of chartered. And mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. It's one that you can commit to memory, this poem. And so it's a good one to really think about as your choice for an unseen text, if that's not the one that comes up.